A man's staff transforms into a living serpent and consumes other serpents whole. The earth splits open and devours complete families while they're still breathing. Serpents made of bronze cure fatal snakebites through a simple look. And a donkey engages in full dialogue with the person who owns it, discussing an angel holding a sword that only the animal can see. If you believe the Book of Numbers is nothing more than a dull population count, you're completely mistaken. This actually stands as one of the most thrilling, supernaturally charged, and intensely dramatic books you'll find anywhere in Scripture. And I'm going to demonstrate this to you by going through each incredible story from start to finish. But before we begin, please take a second to like this video and hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. I always appreciate hearing from you. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Share where you're viewing from and what the current time is. It genuinely helps us feel like the worldwide community we truly are. So, with that said, let's get started, shall we? Reframing the fourth book. Turn in your Bible to the fourth book. It's labeled Numbers. The name makes it sound like some ancient tax record, something lifeless and bureaucratic. Teachers in Sunday school pass right over it. Ministers extract isolated stories from it, but they seldom preach it as a complete work. The title alone has caused harm, giving the false impression of a ledger book when what you're actually holding is something far darker and far more potent. The Hebrew tradition names this book in the wilderness. That title reveals everything. This isn't about tallying numbers, it's about wandering aimlessly. It's about a generation that arrived at the edge of everything they were promised, and instead selected the void. The population counts frame the story like brackets around a collective catastrophe, measuring not simply how many people there are, but the magnitude of what was lost. Imagine a three-act tragedy performed in the desert. The first act reveals a nation at its strongest point, structured and sanctified, prepared to advance toward its destiny. The second act documents the falling apart, one rebellion followed by another, the complete breakdown of trust between a people and the one who delivered them. The third act shows purgatory, 4 decades of waiting for a generation under condemnation to disappear so their children can make another attempt. Standing between these acts are 2 military population counts, separated by close to 40 years. The initial count tallies 600,000 fighting men, not including women and children. A tremendous multitude freshly escaped from Egypt, arranged into tribes and encampments, prepared for conquest. The second count, conducted at the identical location where the book concludes, tallies a new generation. Nearly everyone from that first count has perished. 2 men made it through the interval, Joshua and Caleb, the only scouts who had faith in the promise. This defines the structure of the book. You observe an entire generation receive everything: freedom, divine law, God's presence among them, and discard it all through fear, wearing the mask of practical thinking. The tragedy intensifies because their failure appears so logical. Who wouldn't feel afraid of cities with walls and warriors of enormous size? Who wouldn't long for familiar meals after months of eating manna? The rebels in Numbers aren't cartoonish villains. They express worries that sound nearly reasonable until you understand they're essentially calling God a deceiver. The wilderness transforms into the setting for this unfolding drama. Not wilderness as metaphor, but the actual Sinai Peninsula, the Negev Desert, and territories lying east of the Jordan. Actual geography, actual scorching heat, actual desperate thirst. The Israelites traverse the same barren stretches where Bedouin tribes would barely survive for thousands of years afterward. The place itself becomes a character, an instructor, and an executioner. What distinguishes this tragedy from Greek theatrical drama or the Falls in Shakespeare is the theological dimension woven through it. The people don't suffer because of fate or unfortunate circumstances. They suffer because of their choices. God extends to them a land. They turn it down. God sentences them to wander aimlessly. They attempt to invade regardless, and they fail. The pattern keeps repeating. Divine offer, human refusal, consequence, frantic attempt to undo the consequence, failure. The book trains you to perceive freedom and bondage, not as external circumstances, but as postures rooted in trust or rooted in fear. Numbers also denies you the easy comfort of having villains to blame. Moses himself experiences failure. Aaron takes part in challenges directed at his brother. Miriam speaks out against the chosen leader. The people aren't monstrous. They're exhausted, terrified, refugees wanting water and meat, and some reasonable guarantee they won't die. Their complaints sound like things you yourself might say after months of nomadic struggle. The text refuses to let you create distance between yourself and them. You're implicated in their failures because you recognize their fears as identical to your own. The structure itself communicates meaning. The book begins with careful order, population counts, camp organization, tribal positioning, duties of the Levites, everything categorized, every person assigned a specific place. By the middle portion, chaos breaks out, disease, earthquake, poisonous serpents. The closing section reveals painful rebuilding. A second count, fresh laws, preparation for entering the land. But the leader who guided them this distance cannot make the crossing. The cost of the wilderness years includes Moses himself, laid to rest in an unmarked grave on the eastern side of the river. Readers today often approach Numbers as a collection of moral lessons or verses to quote, "We pull out the bronze serpent, the donkey that talks, the staff that blooms, and catalogue them as teaching illustrations." This method misses the accumulated weight of it all. The book wants you to experience the duration, the relentless repetition of desert existence, the soul-crushing awareness that your parents' generation chose death and you're living in the wake of their decision. The census figures themselves communicate the story. The initial count reveals a powerful host. The second reveals minor decrease in certain tribes, increase in others. But the crushing reality is that almost nobody tallied in chapter 1 appears in chapter 26. A generation passed away in the time between these lists. The numbers aren't bookkeeping. They're death notices. This book stands as the turning point between freedom and inheritance. Exodus brings you out. Leviticus makes you consecrated. Numbers poses the question of whether you trust enough to go in. Deuteronomy reviews the entire story from Moses' viewpoint, but Numbers gives you the unfiltered experience. The heat beating down, the complaints rising up, the failures mounting, the long, barren years when nothing appears to happen except people aging and dying, intense. You're about to step into a story spanning 4 decades, multiple generations, and the entire theological question of whether human beings can maintain trust in an invisible God when their circumstances seem to argue against him. The book qualifies as tragedy because it didn't need to conclude this way. The land had been promised, the people stood ready, all the pieces were in position, and they refused. Act 1. Sinai's shadow, organization, and high hopes. The book begins on the first day of the second month of the second year following Egypt. Count backward. The Exodus took place. The law descended. The tabernacle got constructed and raised up. Now, approximately 13 months after departing from Pharaoh, the people stand at Sinai, organized and prepared to march forward. God instructs Moses to conduct a census. This isn't bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. Ancient Near Eastern censuses fulfilled military and administrative functions. You count to determine how many warriors you can deploy, how much food requires provisioning, how to structure march sequence and camp arrangement. The census measures capacity for military conquest. The count proceeds tribe by tribe. Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, Dan, Asher, Naphtali. Levi receives a separate count. Their function differs from the remaining tribes. The numbers prove massive. 603,550 fighting men. Include women, children, and the elderly, and you're examining over 2 million people. Scholars engage in debate over these figures. Some interpret them word for word. Others propose scribal mistakes or suggest the Hebrew term translated as thousand might signify something different, a clan, a unit, or a military company. The debate holds less importance than the narrative purpose. The text wants you to grasp that this represents a substantial host, not some ragged collection of refugees. They've expanded from 70 people entering Egypt centuries before to a nation capable of challenging Canaanite city-states. Following the count comes arrangement. God provides Moses with detailed instructions for camp organization. The tabernacle occupies the center. Immediately surrounding it, the Levites establish their camp. Kohathites to the south, Gershonites to the west, Merarites to the north. Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons camp on the eastern side, protecting the entrance. Beyond the Levites, the 12 tribes position themselves in 4 groups of 3, one group facing each cardinal direction. The eastern camp contains Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Judah takes the lead, positioned symbolically facing the tabernacle entrance. The southern camp holds Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. The western camp contains Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, the descendants of Joseph. The northern camp holds Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. Each tribal cluster receives a designated leader, specific population numbers, and assigned positioning. This arrangement creates an enormous square or rectangle with the tabernacle positioned at the absolute center. When they march forward, the sequence holds significance. Judah's camp leads the way. The tabernacle and those carrying it follow, surrounded by Levites. The remaining tribes form the rear guard and the flanks. Picture this: a mobile city built around sacred space, moving through desert terrain like a living illustration of cosmic order. The Levites receive particular attention. Unlike the remaining tribes counted for military service, Levites stand set apart for sanctuary duties. The firstborn of every Israelite family technically belongs to God, consecrated, following the Passover, when God preserved Hebrew firstborns in Egypt. But rather than claiming each family's eldest son, God accepts the Levite tribe as their replacement. The Levites become living substitutes, standing in the position where all Israel's firstborn would otherwise be required to serve. Each Levitical clan receives distinct responsibilities. The Kohathites transport the holy items, the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altars, but they're prohibited from touching these objects directly, or they'll die. Aaron's sons must cover everything before the Kohathites come near. The Gershonites move the tent fabric, curtains, and screens. The Merarites transport the structural components, frames, posts, bases, and pegs. 3 clans, 1 tabernacle, every piece accounted for and delegated. Beyond Levitical structure, the text addresses camp purity regulations. Anyone with contagious skin disease, bodily discharge, or corpse contamination must temporarily reside outside the camp. This isn't random disgust. The camp itself carries holiness because God dwells at its center. Impurity isn't identical to sin, but it's incompatible with closeness to divine presence. The regulations safeguard both the individual person and the community as a whole. The section also contains laws concerning restitution, jealousy trials, and Nazirite vows. These appear scattered until you recognize they all address holiness within community. Restitution laws guarantee justice. The jealousy trial offers suspected brides a judicial process for accusations that could otherwise tear families apart. The Nazirite vow permits individuals to consecrate themselves temporarily to God through abstaining from wine, refraining from cutting hair, and avoiding contact with corpses. Samson and Samuel will later become lifetime Nazirites, but here the vow typically remains temporary, a method for ordinary people to deepen their devotion. Then arrives the dedication of the tabernacle. Each tribal leader presents identical offerings across 12 days. 1 silver dish weighing 130 shekels, 1 silver basin of 70 shekels, both filled with grain offering, 1 gold ladle of 10 shekels filled with incense, 1 bull, 1 ram, 1 lamb for burnt offering, 1 goat for purification offering, 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 male goats, 5 lambs for fellowship offering. 12 days, 12 identical gifts. The repetition feels monotonous when you're reading it, but picture the ceremony repeating day after day, tribe after tribe, each presenting the same gift, displaying unity and equality before God. The Levites experience their own consecration ritual. They're shaved, washed, and presented as a wave offering before the Lord, meaning they're symbolically lifted or waved, marking them for divine service. The ritual separates them from the remaining tribes, establishing their new identity as those who maintain the sacred. Throughout these chapters, optimism fills the air. The people stand organized, consecrated, equipped, and prepared. They've received the law at Sinai, they've constructed the tabernacle, they've witnessed God's glory descend. The difficult part appears finished. Ahead lies an 11-day journey to Canaan. Battles they're equipped to win, and entrance into the land promised to their ancestors centuries before. The text provides no hint yet of approaching disaster. Everything points toward success. The nation that departed Egypt as slaves now operates as a holy army with God positioned at its center. They possess leadership, structure, law, and divine presence. What could possibly go wrong? The mobile, sacred city. The camp as a microcosm of the universe. The Israelite camp wasn't random arrangement. Every detail encoded significance, creating a portable sacred geography representing cosmic order. On the march, positioned at the center, stood the tabernacle. Not simply a religious structure, but the designated meeting point between heaven and earth, the localized presence of the God who created everything. The structure itself displayed deliberate symbolism. The innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, contained the Ark with its mercy seat, the actual throne of God. One room outward, the holy place held the lampstand, the table of bread, and the incense altar, all representing aspects of creation maintained by divine order. The outer courtyard contained the bronze altar for sacrifices and the bronze basin for priestly washing. As you moved from outside toward the center, space became increasingly holier. Ordinary people entered only the courtyard. Priests could enter the holy place each day. The high priest alone entered the Holy of Holies once each year on the Day of Atonement. Closeness to the center demanded increasing holiness. Surrounding the tabernacle, the Levites established a buffer zone. Their positioning wasn't accidental. They stood between the holy objects and the tribes, protecting both sides. If an unauthorized person approached the tabernacle, the Levites intervened. If holiness radiated outward dangerously, the Levites absorbed it. They mediated sacred space. Beyond the Levites, the 12 tribes arranged themselves in quadrants. This created concentric rectangles, tabernacle at center, Levites surrounding it, tribes forming the outer perimeter. The entire camp became a mandala of holiness, with gradations of sanctity rippling outward from the divine presence at the hub. The 4 tribal camps aligned with cardinal directions, implying cosmic scope. In ancient Near Eastern thought, 4 directions represented completeness, the whole earth. By positioning tribes this way, the camp symbolically encompassed all creation. They didn't simply represent Israel. They modeled redeemed humanity, organized around divine presence. Each tribe's position also carried symbolic significance. Judah camped east, facing the tabernacle entrance, the position of honor. Judah would eventually produce kings, and according to later tradition, the Messiah. Reuben, the firstborn who forfeited his birthright through sin, camped south, significant but not preeminent. Ephraim, Joseph's younger son who received the greater blessing, led the western camp. Dan brought up the rear to the north, a position that later tradition connected with judgment and danger. When the camp moved forward, the sequence mattered as much as the static arrangement. Judah broke camp first, leading the march. Then the tabernacle underwent dismantling. Gershonites and Merarites transported structural components forward. Reuben's camp followed next. Then came the Kohathites, bearing the holy objects, timed precisely so the structure could be reassembled before the most sacred items arrived. Ephraim's camp followed after, then Dan, sweeping up stragglers and functioning as rear guard. This mobile city covered miles when they encamped. 2 million people spread across the desert, organized into tribes and clans, everyone knowing their designated position. Ancient sources propose the camp might have stretched several miles in each direction. When they marched, the column would extend for miles, a river of humanity flowing through wilderness. The camp also operated as spiritual instruction. Every morning you woke and observed the tabernacle at the center, God's presence visible as cloud by day and fire by night. Your position relative to that center defined your identity. You weren't simply a person. You were a member of a particular tribe with a particular place in relation to holiness. The layout taught constant awareness of God's centrality. The purity regulations reinforced this spatial theology. Impurity demanded temporary exile outside the camp. You departed the ordered holy community and dwelt beyond its borders until cleansed. Then you returned. The boundary between inside and outside the camp became the boundary between purity and impurity, order and chaos, life with God and separation from Him. The camp mirrored creation itself. In Genesis, God brings order from chaos through acts of separation, light from darkness, water from land, day from night. The camp accomplished the same thing. It carved ordered holy space from the formless wilderness. As long as the structure held, as long as everyone maintained their position and purity, the camp stood as a small triumph of divine order over chaotic nature. This makes the approaching rebellions more devastating. When people challenge the arrangement, questioning why Levites alone serve the tabernacle, why Moses and Aaron lead exclusively, why they can't approach God directly, they're not simply complaining about authority structures. They're threatening to collapse the careful structure that makes divine presence among them possible. Rebellion transforms into cosmic threat. The camp also foreshadowed the ultimate goal, Canaan itself. Once established in the land, the tribes would spread across territories, but the tabernacle would remain central, eventually positioned in Shiloh, then Jerusalem. The portable order would become permanent. The temporary arrangement modeled the future state. For now, though, they live in tents. The entire city assembles and disassembles at divine command. Nothing remains permanent except the presence at the center. The tabernacle can be packed, transported, and erected again elsewhere. God travels with them, and they arrange themselves around Him wherever He directs them. This spatial theology explains ancient Israel's horror at the tabernacle or later temple being violated or destroyed. These weren't simply religious buildings. They were the structural center of reality, the point where heaven contacted earth. Attack them, and you attack the cosmic order itself. The camp embodied a vision, humanity organized correctly around divine presence, every person knowing their place, holiness radiating from center to outer edge. For this moment at Sinai, the vision held. The camp stood as designed, perfect order beneath the mountain where God gave the law, the cloud and fire, the unsettling guidance of God. On the day the tabernacle was erected, cloud covered it. From evening until morning, the cloud appeared as fire. This pattern continued without fail, cloud by day, fire by night, visible to the entire camp. The pillar stood over the tabernacle, marking God's presence among them. The cloud guided their movement. When it lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites broke camp. When it settled, they encamped. Sometimes the cloud stayed 2 days, sometimes a month, sometimes a year. However long it remained, they stayed put. When it lifted, they marched. This sounds like blessing, direct divine guidance, no guessing, no debate. But consider the psychological weight of it. You can't make plans. You can't say, we'll rest here 2 weeks while the flocks graze and we repair equipment. You might wake tomorrow and see the cloud lifting, demanding immediate departure. Or you might plan to leave soon and find the cloud settled for months more. The cloud demanded absolute trust and constant readiness. You learned to live with packed bags, so to speak. Your life became an exercise in surrender. Human autonomy yielded to divine sovereignty. You went when He said go, stopped when He said stop, and you never knew in advance which it would be. The visible presence also meant accountability. You couldn't pretend God was distant or abstract. The pillar stood before everyone each day. When you complained in full view of the fire. When you sinned beneath the cloud. The presence that guided also witnessed everything. Privilege came with scrutiny. The dual nature of the pillar, cloud, and fire captures something essential about God's character in this narrative. Cloud suggests covering, protection, shade in the desert heat, blessing. Fire suggests danger, holiness that consumes, the presence you cannot approach carelessly. Both are true at the same time. The same presence that shields also threatens. You're safe as long as you maintain proper relation to it, but breach that relation and the fire can turn against you. The wilderness setting intensified this dynamic. In comfortable circumstances, delayed guidance feels like patience. In desert conditions, delay means depleting supplies, exhausting grazing areas, wondering if you'll survive. When the cloud lingered, faith underwent testing. Does he know we're running low on water? Has he forgotten us? When it lifted suddenly, after long stillness, you scrambled to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. The pillar also prevented independence. They couldn't scout ahead and select their route. They couldn't send emissaries to negotiate passage through nations in advance. They moved at divine pace on divine schedule to divine destinations. This total dependence nurtured trust in ideal conditions. In practice, it fostered resentment. Adults desire agency. Refugees especially crave control after experiencing the powerlessness of slavery. The cloud's timing seems sometimes almost instructional, designed to teach rather than merely guide. Stay in one spot long enough to settle in, then move. Move quickly through several locations, then stop abruptly in an inhospitable spot for months. The pattern breaks you of the illusion that you control your life. You learn viscerally that God's timetable doesn't match human preference. Later, when rebellions erupt, the people's complaints gain context. They've lived under this regime for months. No autonomy, no planning, total dependence. The system works if you trust God's goodness. Doubt that goodness, and the same system feels like manipulation or tyranny. The mechanics don't change. Your interpretation of them does. The pillar also prevented them from retreating to Egypt, even if they wanted to, at least not easily. The cloud didn't lead backward. It led forward through wilderness, circling toward Canaan from the south. To return to Egypt meant abandoning the pillar, setting out on your own, navigating desert without divine guidance. The very means of blessing became a form of constraint. At night, the fire provided light. In pre-modern conditions, darkness was total. No streetlights, no ambient glow. The fire over the tabernacle meant the camp never fell into complete blackness. You could always orient yourself by the glow. You knew where the center was. The fire functioned as a beacon, guiding not just the march but daily existence. Yet fire also kept people awake. Some nights you'd see the pillar blazing and remember stories of Sinai, how the mountain burned, how God descended in fire and smoke, how people begged Moses to mediate because they couldn't bear direct encounter. The same fire that comforted also reminded you that the God in your midst could obliterate you instantly if holiness and sin collided. The mechanics of following the cloud required communication systems. Trumpets signaled assembly and march orders. When the cloud lifted, trumpets blew different blasts for breaking camp versus general assembly. The sound carried across the sprawling encampment, relaying divine command through human instruments. The system combined transcendent guidance with practical logistics. Moses describes the routine. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year that the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, the Israelites camped and did not set out. But when it lifted, they set out. The verse conveys monotonous obedience, day after day, week after week, watching the cloud, waiting, responding. This was their life, watching the sky, packed and ready, trusting that movement meant guidance toward the goal, even when the route seemed wrong. The cloud also unified them. Rich and poor, Judah and Dan, Levite and ordinary person, everyone followed the same signal. No one got advance notice, no one negotiated a different route. The pillar was democratically tyrannical. It commanded everyone equally, blessed everyone equally, and gave everyone the same information simultaneously. In this sense, the cloud enforced community. Yet the coming rebellion proves that seeing the same sign doesn't guarantee identical faith. Two people can watch the cloud and interpret differently. One sees provision, guidance, presence. Another sees arbitrary control, confusing delays, questionable routes. The pillar guided, but it didn't coerce belief. You still had to choose whether to trust the one guiding or resent the lack of explanation. Act 2. The rebellion cycle begins. From craving to contempt, the cloud lifted, trumpets sounded. After nearly a year at Sinai, the march toward Canaan began. The tribes set out in sequence. Judah leading, tabernacle following, remaining camps bringing up the rear. Everything proceeded as prescribed. 11 days' journey to the border, then conquest. The mood should have been triumphant. 3 days into the march, the people complained. The text doesn't specify the complaint, just says the people voiced grievances about hardship. Fire broke out at the edges of the camp, consuming some of the outer tents. Moses interceded. The fire stopped. They named the place Taberah, burning, marking the first crack in unity. The second complaint followed immediately. The rabble among them, possibly the mixed multitude of non-Israelites who left Egypt with them, began craving meat. The cravings spread. Soon the Israelites joined in. Who will feed us meat? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for free, the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions and garlic. Now our appetite is gone. There's nothing but this manna. The complaint reveals deep dysfunction. They romanticize slavery as free fish and pleasant vegetables, conveniently forgetting the forced labor, murdered infants, and brutal oppression. Manna, bread from heaven that sustained them daily, becomes this manna, said with contempt. Provision becomes prison, gift becomes grievance. God's anger burns. Moses, caught between God's fury and the people's contempt, breaks. He prays desperately. Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? Why have I not found favor with you, that you burden me with all these people? Did I conceive them? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them like a nursing child to the land you promised their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep crying to me for meat. I can't carry all these people alone. The burden is too heavy. If this is how you're going to treat me, just end me now. Don't let me face my own ruin. Moses' prayer startles us. He's close to resignation, suicidal in his despair. Leadership has broken him. The great deliverer wants out. God responds not with rebuke but with help. He tells Moses to gather 70 elders. God will take some of the Spirit on Moses and distribute it among them so they can share the burden of leadership. God also promises meat, so much meat they'll grow sick of it. You'll eat it until it comes out your nostrils and you loathe it, because you rejected the Lord who is among you and cried before him, "Why did we ever leave Egypt?" Moses doubts. 600,000 men plus families, where could meat come from to feed them for a month? God asks, is the Lord's arm too short? You'll see whether my word comes true. The Spirit distributes among the 70 elders. They prophesy temporarily, apparently ecstatic utterance, marking them as Spirit-filled. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, who remained in camp rather than going to the tabernacle, also prophesied. Joshua, concerned about proper order, asks Moses to stop them. Moses refuses. Are you jealous for my sake? I wish all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. Then the wind comes. Quail blow in from the sea, falling exhausted around the camp, piled 3 feet deep for miles in every direction. The people gather frantically. Some collect 10 homers, roughly 60 bushels. They spread quail around the camp to dry and preserve. While the meat is still between their teeth, before they finish chewing, plague strikes. Many die, buried at Kibroth Hatava, graves of craving. The pattern is established: complaint, divine provision, laced with judgment, death. The second rebellion cycle begins at Hazeroth. Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses, questioning his unique authority. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? The text notes their grievance involved Moses' Cushite wife, perhaps Zipporah, or possibly a second wife from Cush, modern Ethiopia or Sudan. God summons all three to the tabernacle. He descends in the pillar, stands at the entrance, and calls Aaron and Miriam forward. Then he speaks, "Hear my words. When prophets of the Lord arise, I reveal myself in visions and speak in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him directly, clearly, not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why weren't you afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" God's anger burns against them. The cloud lifts. Miriam stands leprous, her skin like snow, the text says, meaning diseased, flaking, white with infection. Aaron, seeing her, begs Moses, "Please, my Lord, don't hold this sin against us which we committed so foolishly. Don't let her be like a stillborn child whose flesh is half consumed when it comes from the womb." Moses cries to God, "Please, God, heal her." God responds that she must bear shame for 7 days. If her father had spit in her face, she'd be excluded 7 days. So let her be confined outside the camp 7 days. Miriam is removed. The camp waits. After 7 days, she returns healed. They march to the wilderness of Paran. 3 rebellions in rapid succession. First, vague complaints about hardship. Second, craving for meat, romanticizing slavery. Third, challenge to Moses' authority from his own siblings. Each escalates. Each brings divine response: fire, plague, disease. The honeymoon period is over. The cracks widen. What's remarkable is the speed. Days into the march, unity fractures. The people who stood at Sinai, who built the tabernacle and witnessed its dedication, who marched out, organized and ready, they unravel almost immediately. The organized camp becomes a complaining mob. The holy nation reveals itself as a fragile coalition held together only by visible miracle. And even visible miracle isn't enough. Moses' emotional state deteriorates. He goes from confident leader to suicidal intercessor to exhausted mediator between God's wrath and the people's rebellion. The toll of leadership becomes unbearable. Even Miriam, the prophetess who led women in song at the sea, falls into jealousy and challenges her brother's unique calling. The wilderness itself intensifies every tension. In Egypt, they had slavery, but also stability, predictable oppression, familiar food, permanent housing. In the wilderness, everything is unstable. Food appears daily, but you can't stockpile it. Water comes miraculously, but not always when you want it. The cloud guides, but doesn't explain. They're perpetually dependent, perpetually uncertain, perpetually unable to control their circumstances. This dependence, meant to build trust, instead breeds resentment. They interpret reliance as weakness. They see provision as meager. They remember oppression as comfort. The psychological dynamics of traumatized people surface. Better the devil you know than the uncertainty of freedom. Better slavery's predictability than a promise that requires faith. The rebellions also reveal social dynamics. The rabble influences the Israelites. Craving spreads like contagion. One person's discontent becomes communal crisis. Leaders themselves aren't immune. Miriam and Aaron, closest to Moses, challenge him publicly. If his siblings doubt his unique calling, how can the masses trust him? The stage is set for catastrophe. 3 rebellions have occurred in quick succession. Divine judgment has struck 3 times. Moses is exhausted. The people are bitter. They're approaching the border of Canaan, where spies will scout the land. The next rebellion won't be about food or authority. It'll be about whether to enter the promise at all. The spies report the psychology of a panicked majority. They reached Kadesh on Canaan's southern border. The land promised to Abraham centuries ago lay ahead. God commanded Moses, "Send men to scout the land I'm giving the Israelites. Send 1 leader from each ancestral tribe." 12 men went. Shammua from Reuben, Shaphat from Simeon, Caleb from Judah, Igal from Issachar, Hoshea, whom Moses renamed Joshua, from Ephraim, Palti from Benjamin, Gadiel from Zebulun, Gadi from Manasseh, Amiel from Dan, Sethur from Asher, Nabi from Naphtali, Guel from Gad. All leaders, all chosen specifically for this task. Moses instructed them, "Scout the land. See what it's like, whether the people are strong or weak, few or many. Check the towns. Are they fortified? Is the soil fertile? Bring back fruit as evidence." 40 days they scouted, traveling from the wilderness of Zin in the south through the Negev into the hill country as far north as Rehob near Lebo Hamath. They reached the valley of Eshcol and cut a cluster of grapes so massive it required 2 men to carry it on a pole, along with pomegranates and figs. The land's fertility was undeniable. It literally flowed with abundance. They returned to Kadesh and presented their findings. The initial report was factual. "We went into the land where you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit." Then the devastating turn. However, the people living there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. Caleb interrupted, silencing the people before Moses. "We should go up at once and possess it, because we can certainly conquer it." But the other scouts contradicted him. "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." They began spreading negative reports. "The land devours its inhabitants. All the people we saw are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we must have seemed the same to them." The entire community broke into weeping that night. People cried until morning. Then the complaints turned accusatory, directed at Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" they said to each other. "Let's appoint a leader and return to Egypt." Moses and Aaron fell face down before the whole assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, a sign of grief and horror, and addressed the community. "The land we passed through and scouted is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he'll bring us into this land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. We'll devour them. Their protection has been removed, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them." The assembly responded by threatening to stone Joshua and Caleb. At that moment, the Lord's glory appeared at the tabernacle before all the Israelites. That phrase reveals everything. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. They measured themselves against the giants and found themselves tiny. They forgot to factor in the God who drowned Pharaoh's army, split the sea, rained bread from heaven, led them by fire and cloud. They calculated based on human resources alone. The minority, Caleb and Joshua, saw the same obstacles but framed them differently. Their protection has been removed. They perceived the Canaanites as already defeated, awaiting divine judgment through Israelite conquest. The obstacles remained real, but divine promise made them irrelevant. "The Lord is with us" negated every military advantage the enemy possessed. The majority report spread panic because fear is contagious. Once 10 authoritative voices declared conquest impossible, the crowd accepted it as fact. The people didn't investigate independently. They didn't pray or seek divine guidance. They heard bad news from leaders they trusted and spiraled into despair. The despair quickly mutated into accusation against God. "Why is the Lord bringing us here to fall by the sword?" They reframed divine promise as divine betrayal. God wasn't leading them to inheritance, he was leading them to slaughter. Their wives and children, the very people God promised to establish in the land, would be plunder for giants. This accusation inverted reality. God had promised Abraham this land 4 centuries earlier. God delivered them from Egypt. God sustained them in wilderness. God gave them his presence, his law, his covenant. Now, at the threshold of fulfillment, they accused him of malice. The proposal to return to Egypt completed the rebellion. They didn't just refuse to enter Canaan, they actively chose slavery over promise. Let's appoint a leader and go back. This was mutiny, rejecting Moses' leadership and by extension rejecting the God who appointed him. They'd come full circle, from crying out for deliverance in Egypt to preferring Egypt over freedom. The psychology underneath is fear disguised as pragmatism. The spies couched their report in reasonable language: fortified cities, powerful people, strategic concerns. This wasn't irrational panic. It was sober military assessment, they claimed. But beneath the reasonable facade lay terror and faithlessness. They trusted their eyes over God's word. The threat to stone Caleb and Joshua reveals mob mentality. The two men who believed the promise became targets. Rather than consider their arguments, the crowd wanted them silenced permanently. Dissent from the consensus provoked violence. The majority, having decided conquest was impossible, couldn't tolerate voices saying otherwise. The text emphasizes corporate decision-making. This wasn't a few malcontents stirring trouble. The whole community wept, complained, and plotted return. This was national choice. 600,000 men plus families collectively deciding to reject the promise. The scale of the refusal magnified the tragedy. What makes the scene more painful is timing. They stood at the border. 40 days of scouting proved the land's goodness. The grapes from Eshcol testified to abundance. They'd come so far. Sinai, tabernacle, law, covenant, organization. Everything pointed toward entry. At the last moment, they said no. The minority tried desperately to reverse the tide. Joshua and Caleb didn't just argue, they tore their clothes in anguish, used emphatic language. Exceedingly good land, don't be afraid. The Lord is with us. They staked their lives on the promise, the crowd prepared to stone them for it. Divine glory, appearing at the tabernacle, interrupted the stoning. God had heard enough. The people's rebellion, couched as reasonable caution, was about to meet judgment, and Moses would once again stand between divine wrath and national annihilation. The divine sentence, a generation condemned to wander. God spoke to Moses. How long will these people despise me? How long will they not trust me despite all the signs I've performed among them? I'll strike them with plague, destroy them, and make you into a nation greater and mightier than they are. Moses interceded immediately, arguing not from the people's merit. He had none to cite, but from God's reputation. The Egyptians will hear about this. You brought this people from among them by your power. They've told the inhabitants of this land. They've heard you are among this people, that you appear directly. Your cloud stands over them. You go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. If you end these people, the nations who've heard of your fame will say the Lord wasn't able to bring this people into the land he swore to give them, so he ended them in the wilderness. Moses then reminded God of his own self-description from Sinai. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in faithful love, forgiving iniquity and rebellion. Yet he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generation. Then Moses prayed, "Please pardon the iniquity of this people in keeping with the greatness of your faithful love, just as you've forgiven them from Egypt until now." God answered, "I have pardoned them as you requested. Yet as surely as I live, and as the whole earth is filled with the Lord's glory, none of the men who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet tested me these 10 times and did not obey me, will ever see the land I swore to give their fathers. None of those who despised me will see it. But my servant Caleb has a different spirit and has followed me completely. I'll bring him into the land where he went, and his descendants will possess it. Since the Amalekites and Canaanites are living in the lowlands, turn back tomorrow and head for the wilderness in the direction of the Sea of Reeds." Then God laid out the specific sentence. "How long will this wicked community complain about me? I have heard the complaints the Israelites make against me. Tell them, as surely as I live, this is the Lord's declaration, I will do to you exactly as I heard you say. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness, all of you who were registered in the census, the entire number of you 20 years old or more, because you have complained about me. I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. I'll bring your children, whom you said would be plunder, into the land you rejected, and they will enjoy it. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and bear the penalty for your acts of unfaithfulness until all your corpses lie scattered in the wilderness. You will bear the consequences of your iniquities 40 years, based on the number of the 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. You'll know what it means to have me against you. The sentence was precise. The generation that left Egypt, everyone 20 and older at the time of the census, would die in the wilderness over 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies scouted. Only Caleb and Joshua would survive to enter. The children they claimed would become plunder would inherit instead. The adults who refused the promise would wander until the last of them fell. God continued, I, the Lord, have spoken. I swear that I will do this to the entire wicked community that has conspired against me. They will come to an end in the wilderness, and there they will die. The 10 spies who brought the bad report died immediately, struck down by plague before the Lord. Only Joshua and Caleb survived of the 12 scouts. Moses reported God's words to the Israelites. The people mourned deeply. Early the following morning, they went up toward the ridge of the hill country, declaring, Let's go to the place the Lord promised, for we have sinned. Moses warned them. Why are you going against the Lord's command? It won't succeed. Don't go because the Lord is not among you. Don't let yourselves be struck down by your enemies. The Amalekites and Canaanites will face you there, and you'll fall by the sword. Because you turned from following the Lord, he won't be with you. They went anyway, presuming to march into the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark moved from the camp. The Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in that region came down, struck them, and routed them as far as Hormah. The judgment contained terrible logic. The people said, If only we died in the wilderness. God responded, Your wish is granted. They claimed their children would be plundered. God said, Your children will inherit, you will die. They accused him of bringing them to the wilderness to perish. He made it so, but as consequence of their choice, not his original intent. The sentence matched the sin. They refused to trust God for 40 days, the spies' mission duration. They'd wander 40 years, 1 year per day. They complained they'd rather die in wilderness than enter Canaan. They'd die in wilderness, never seeing Canaan. They said their children would be victims, their children would be victors instead. Every accusation they made against God was transformed into their actual fate. Not because God was cruel, but because he took their express preference seriously. The death of the 10 spies served as preview. They corrupted the people's faith and died instantly. The rest would take 4 decades to die, but the process began immediately. From this point forward, the narrative marks time by funerals. 40 years meant an entire generation living under death sentence. Picture it. You're 25 years old, healthy, able-bodied. You just learned you'll never see the promise. You'll spend the rest of your life in tents wandering until you collapse and die somewhere in the sand. Your children will inherit everything you refused. You chose this, but living with the consequence is another matter entirely. The exceptions, Caleb and Joshua, stood as living reproach to everyone else. These 2 alone believed. These 2 alone would cross. Their survival demonstrated that the sentence wasn't arbitrary or inevitable. Faith would have saved them all. Faithlessness condemned them. The immediate attempt to invade after the decree showed human nature perfectly. After refusing to enter when God commanded, they tried to enter when he forbade it. After claiming conquest was impossible, they attempted it without divine backing. They got everything backward. Yes when God said no, no when God said yes. Presumption replaced faith. Pride. replaced humility. They paid for it with a crushing military defeat at Hormah, whose name means destruction. The 40 years began. A generation condemned, 2 survivors, children waiting to inherit what their parents spurned. The failed counterattack, desperation after rejection. The Amalekites and Canaanites routed the Israelites at Hormah, driving them back in defeat. This battle lasted only verses in the text, but its theological weight is enormous. It's the first military engagement since leaving Egypt where Israel loses decisively. What made this defeat different from future battles wasn't tactics or numbers. It was timing and authorization. They attacked after God explicitly withdrew his presence. Moses warned them directly, "The Lord is not among you." The ark stayed in camp. The cloud remained stationary. Every sign indicated God's absence, yet they marched anyway. The text describes them as presuming to go up into the hill country. That word choice matters. Presumption is faith's evil twin. It looks similar, but operates from pride rather than trust. True faith acts because God commands. Presumption acts because humans decide its time, regardless of divine instruction. Their motivation was complex, partly genuine remorse. "We have sinned" suggests real conviction, partly desperation. Facing 40 years wandering was unbearable, so they tried to undo the sentence. Partly shame, they'd just been called cowards by implication, so they attempted to prove their courage. The motivations were mixed, but the fundamental error was the same. They sought to claim by human effort what can only be received as divine gift. The defeat at Hormah demonstrated a principle that would repeat throughout Israel's history. God's presence makes victory possible. His absence makes defeat certain. The same cities they'd conquer 40 years later under Joshua proved impregnable now. Nothing about Canaanite military capacity changed. What changed was whether God fought for Israel. The Amalekites' presence in the battle is significant. These were the people who attacked Israel at Rephidim shortly after the Exodus, the cowardly assault on stragglers that prompted God's vow to blot out Amalek's memory. Now they served as instruments of divine judgment against Israel itself. The people God promised to protect from Amalek fell to Amalekite swords because they'd forfeited divine protection. The Canaanites' participation proved the scouts' fear correct in an ironic way. Yes, Canaanites could defeat Israel, but only when God withdrew. The 10 spies said, "We can't beat them because they're too strong." The truth was, we can't beat them if God doesn't fight for us. The scouts measured wrong variables. With God, Canaanite strength was irrelevant. Without God, even weak enemies could crush them. The defeat also validated Joshua and Caleb's earlier claim. Joshua had said their protection has been removed. He meant that divine judgment waited to fall on Canaan through Israel's conquest. The failed attack proved the principle worked in reverse. When Israel's protection was removed, they became vulnerable. Protection came from covenant relationship, not inherent military might. Moses' refusal to accompany them carried weight. As mediator, his presence symbolized God's presence. Where Moses went, the cloud followed. When Moses stayed in camp, so did God. Their decision to attack without Moses' blessing or participation was effectively a decision to attack without God, spiritual suicide disguised as courage. The ark remaining in camp hammered the point home. The ark represented God's throne, his presence among them. It typically went before them in battle. When it stayed behind, so did any hope of victory. They marched toward enemies without their most potent weapon, not swords or spears, but the presence of the Lord who fought for them. The distance they were chased as far as Hormah suggests complete rout. They didn't merely lose. They fled in panic, pursued by enemies who cut them down in retreat. The defeat was comprehensive, humiliating, and entirely predictable. Moses had warned them explicitly. They ignored him and paid immediately. The battle's aftermath gets no elaboration in the text. How many died? Hundreds? Thousands? The text doesn't say, which itself makes a point. The numbers mattered less than the principle. They'd learned or should have learned, that obedience must precede victory, that timing matters as much as courage, that human initiative without divine authorization is worse than useless. The episode also marked the true beginning of the 40 years. The sentence had been pronounced. They'd tried to reverse it by force. They'd failed. Now came acceptance, grudging, bitter acceptance, but acceptance nonetheless. There was no going back to Egypt. There was no going forward to Canaan. Only the endless middle remained, wandering, waiting, dying. The defeat at Hormah stands as bookend to a future victory at the same location. Later, under divine command, they'd conquer this area. Same place, different generation, opposite result. The geography stayed constant. What changed was whether they moved at God's command or their own presumption. Presumption tries to seize blessing on human terms and timing. Faith receives blessing on divine terms and timing. The distance between these postures is measured in corpses scattered across the hill country, struck down not because they were cowardly, but because they were faithless. Faithless when commanded to enter, faithless when commanded to wait. They couldn't get the rhythm right, couldn't learn to move when God said move, and stop when God said stop. Act 3. The long purgatory, life in the waiting room. 40 years, an entire generation under death sentence. The narrative shifts here, becomes fragmented, episodic. Long stretches pass with barely a verse marking them. The structure itself communicates the experience. Time suspended, life in limbo, years blurring together in repetitive cycles of wandering and camping. The people who appear in these chapters are mostly the next generation, children growing up, knowing their parents are condemned, that they're walking through a graveyard in progress. Every adult they know is dying. Some drop quickly, others slowly, but all are heading toward the same end. The wilderness becomes a vast hospice. Daily life continued with strange normality. People married, had children, tended flocks. The tabernacle still stood at the camp center, sacrifices still burned, festivals still marked the year. Passover reminding them of Egypt. Day of Atonement, purifying the community. Feast of Booths, recalling wilderness life. They were still living. The rhythms of religious and domestic life provided structure to the emptiness. But underneath the routine, everyone knew. This wasn't preparation for conquest anymore. This was waiting for parents and grandparents to die, so the children could try what their elders refused. The entire nation became a procession toward mass funerals. The laws given during this period take on strange quality. Instructions about offerings, festivals, purity, all these assume future stability in the land. The condemned generation legislates for a future they'll never see. They create legal frameworks for cities they'll never inhabit, agricultural practices they'll never perform, social structures they'll never experience. They're writing someone else's operating manual. This created bizarre tension, legislating hope while living despair. Every new law reminded them what they'd forfeited. Every statute about planting vineyards or building houses became indictment of their choice at Kadesh. Yet the laws had to be given now, preserved now, so the next generation would know how to live once they entered. The wilderness itself taught lessons. Water was sporadic. Sometimes God provided from rocks. Sometimes they found oases. Sometimes they went thirsty. Food continued daily, manna every morning except the Sabbath, but manna never changed. 40 years of the same meal, morning after morning, sustaining but monotonous. Life reduced to bare existence. The cloud still guided, but now its movements took them nowhere, circling, backtracking, wandering through regions they'd already crossed. They weren't marching toward conquest anymore. They were marking time, tracing meaningless routes through wasteland. The pillar that once promised direction now just moved them from one empty spot to another. Children born in the wilderness knew no other life. Egypt was their parents' story. Canaan was a promise they'd heard about, but never seen. Their entire existence was tent, cloud, manna, and the knowledge that they'd inherit what their parents spurned. They were being raised on loss and promise simultaneously. The older generation lived with deepening bitterness. Some probably held on to faith, trusting God despite the sentence. Others likely grew more resentful as years passed. You can imagine conversations. We're dying because the spies scared us, because we wanted meat, because we didn't trust enough. That makes us deserve 40 years wandering? The questions had no good answers, only the hard reality that choice had consequence. Moses himself aged through these years. He'd been 80 at the Exodus, so he was heading toward 120. The leader who brought them out would die before bringing them in. His own sentence, though for different reasons, meant he shared the fate of those he led. He'd see Jordan from Nebo, but never cross it. The death rate must have been staggering. 600,000 men means roughly 1.5 to 2 million total people. If they all died over 40 years, that's roughly 40 to 50,000 deaths annually, over 100 per day. Every day, burials. Every week, multiple families mourning. Death became normalized, expected, the background static of daily existence. Some surely tried to make the best of it. You can imagine parents telling children, "Learn from our mistake, trust God when you enter, don't repeat our failure." Others probably became cynical, bitter, teaching the next generation resentment instead of faith. The wilderness years shaped that second generation's character as much as the Exodus shaped the first's. The lack of narrative detail in these chapters mirrors the tedium. Few events get recorded because few events happened. They wandered, they camped, they moved, they camped again. Years passed. People died. The same activities repeated endlessly. The text gives you just enough to feel the grinding repetition without forcing you to read 40 years of daily trivia. But that's the point. This was punishment, not active torture, but meaningless existence. They lived without purpose, beyond survival, without goal beyond waiting for death, without hope beyond their children's future. The sentence was boredom, futility, and the slow realization that you chose this, that the land was right there and you said no. The location names that get mentioned during this period, Rithmah, Rimmon Perez, Libnah, Rissah, Kehelatha, mean nothing to us. They meant nothing to them either, probably. Random spots in wilderness where they stop briefly. No significance, no memorable events, just coordinates in a 40-year drift. Yet even in purgatory, God remained. The tabernacle traveled with them. The presence that judged them also accompanied them. They couldn't escape to Egypt. They couldn't advance to Canaan. But they weren't abandoned. God stayed, sustaining them through their sentence, keeping covenant even when they'd broken it. The tragedy deepened as years passed. Children became adults, knowing their parents' generation was condemned. Those adults had children who'd be the generation to actually enter. 3 generations overlapped in the wilderness. The condemned, the transitional, and the inheritors, all living together in tents, all moving at the cloud's command, all suspended between Egypt and Canaan. Some probably died still bitter, never accepting God's justice. Others died repentant, hoping their children would succeed. A few perhaps died at peace, having learned through decades of wandering that God's way was right, even when harsh. The text doesn't tell us. It just records that they died and were buried in the wilderness, graves scattered across miles of sand and rock. This middle section of Numbers is the book's dark heart, not the rebellion scenes. Those are dramatic, theologically rich. This is the aftermath, the consequence lived out day after empty day, year after year, generation dying slowly while the next waits to inherit. Act 3 isn't exciting, it's purposely tedious, mirroring the lived experience of those years. You're meant to feel the weight, the emptiness, the grinding passage of time without progress. This is what faithlessness costs, not dramatic judgment, but the slow death of promise, deferred indefinitely. The second rebellion, Korah's democratic revolt. Sometime into the 40 years, the text doesn't specify exactly when, a Levite named Korah organized opposition. He was a Kohathite, from the clan assigned to carry the tabernacle's holiest objects. High status among Levites, but not a priest. That distinction mattered. Korah recruited allies, Dathan and Abiram from Reuben, along with 250 respected leaders from the community, prominent men, council members. The rebellion was organized, sophisticated, and cut across tribal lines. This wasn't mob violence, it was political challenge. Their arguments sounded reasonable, almost democratic. You've gone too far. Everyone in the community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly? The claim had theological coherence. Back at Sinai, God had said, "You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Holiness belonged to the whole community, not just Moses and Aaron. Every Israelite was consecrated, set apart. So why did Moses monopolize leadership? Why did Aaron's family alone serve as priests? Wasn't this tyranny disguised as divine calling? Moses' response revealed how seriously he took the challenge. He fell face down, a posture of humility, but also alarm. Then he addressed Korah and his followers. "In the morning, the Lord will reveal who belongs to him, who is holy, and who he will bring near to himself. The one he chooses, he will bring near. Do this. Take censers, Korah, and all your followers. Tomorrow, put fire in them and place incense on them before the Lord. Then the man the Lord chooses will be the Holy One. It's you, Levites, who have gone too far." Moses then reframed the rebellion. "Listen, you Levites. Isn't it enough that the God of Israel has separated you from the Israelite community to bring you near himself, to do the work at the Lord's tabernacle and to stand before the community to minister to them? He's brought you near and all your fellow Levites with you, but now you're seeking the priesthood as well. Therefore, you and your followers have conspired against the Lord. As for Aaron, who is he that you should complain about him?" Moses then summoned Dathan and Abiram. They refused to come, sending back a defiant message. "Isn't it enough that you brought us up from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness? Now you also want to lord it over us. What's more, you haven't brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey, or given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you gouge out the eyes of these men? We will not come." Their accusation inverted reality completely. They called Egypt a land flowing with milk and honey, the exact phrase used for Canaan. They accused Moses of failed leadership, claiming he'd promised land and delivered death. The charge was slander, but effective slander, reframing the narrative to make Moses the villain and themselves victims. Moses became angry, rare for him. He told God, "Do not accept their offering. I haven't taken one donkey from them or wronged any of them." Then he instructed Korah, "You and your followers are to appear before the Lord tomorrow, you, they, and Aaron. Each man is to take his censer, put incense on it, and present it before the Lord. 250 censers. You and Aaron are also to present your censers." The next day they assembled. Each man took his censer, put fire and incense in it, and stood with Moses and Aaron at the tabernacle entrance. Korah gathered the whole community against them at the entrance. Then the Lord's glory appeared to the whole community. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Separate yourselves from this community so I may consume them instantly." They fell face down again, pleading, "God, God of the spirits of all flesh, when one man sins, will you vent your wrath on the whole community?" God responded, "Tell the community, get away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." Moses went to Dathan and Abiram, the elders following. He warned the community, "Move away from the tents of these wicked men. Don't touch anything that belongs to them, or you'll be swept away because of all their sins." People moved back from the dwellings. Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at their tent entrances with their wives, children, and infants. Moses announced, "This is how you'll know the Lord sent me to do all these things, and that it wasn't my own idea. If these men die naturally like everyone else, then the Lord hasn't sent me. But if the Lord brings about something unprecedented, if the ground opens and swallows them with all that belongs to them, so they go down alive into Sheol, then you'll know these men have despised the Lord." As soon as he finished speaking, the ground split open beneath them. The earth opened and swallowed them, their households, all Korah's people, and all their possessions. They descended alive into Sheol with all that belonged to them. The earth closed over them, and they vanished from the assembly. All Israel around them fled at their cries, shouting, "The earth might swallow us too." Fire came from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering incense. The next day, the whole community complained against Moses and Aaron, "You have killed the Lord's people." As they assembled against Moses and Aaron and turned toward the tabernacle, the cloud covered it, and the Lord's glory appeared. Moses and Aaron went to the front of the tent. God told Moses, "Get away from this community, so I may consume them instantly." They fell face down. Moses told Aaron, "Take your censer, place fire from the altar in it, add incense, and go quickly to the community to make atonement for them, because wrath has come from the Lord. The plague has begun." Aaron did as Moses said. He ran into the assembly. The plague had already begun among the people, but Aaron offered incense and made atonement. He stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was halted. Those who died from the plague numbered 14,700, besides those who died because of the Korah incident. The rebellion exposed several tensions. First, the appeal to communal holiness versus mediated holiness. Yes, all Israel was holy, but holiness required order, structure, separation. Approaching God carelessly meant death, even for the holy. Priests mediated precisely because unmediated encounter with holiness was lethal. Second, the challenge to leadership. Korah's argument assumed authority was human power grab. Moses countered that authority was divine appointment. The earth opening wasn't Moses' doing. It was God vindicating his chosen mediator. Third, the persistence of rebellion. Even after earthquake and fire, the community blamed Moses and Aaron the next day. "You killed the Lord's people," as if Moses controlled the ground or fire. Their complaint showed determined refusal to accept divine judgment. Fourth, Aaron's role as life-giver. The man accused of false priesthood literally stood between living and dead, his incense halting plague, his mediation saving thousands. The priestly function was demonstrated as grace, not tyranny. The rebellion's sophistication made it dangerous. This wasn't hungry people craving meat. This was theological and political challenge wrapped in language of equality and democracy. Korah offered an appealing vision: flat hierarchy, distributed holiness, leadership by consensus. It sounded progressive. It was deadly. The blooming staff, God's chosen sign of authority. The ground had opened. Families disappeared into the earth. Fire consumed the rebels. The camp stood in shock. The question remained: who speaks for God? Who mediates between the holy and the common? Korah claimed everyone possessed equal access to the divine. The earth's answer suggested otherwise, but doubt lingered. Perhaps the catastrophe was coincidence. Perhaps Moses manipulated events. The people needed something more than destruction. They needed a sign of life. God instructed each tribal leader to bring a wooden staff, 12 rods, one for each tribe. Aaron's staff represented Levi. These weren't ceremonial objects. They were dead wood, cut branches, lifeless. Moses placed them in the tent of meeting before the ark. Overnight, something impossible occurred. Morning came. Moses entered the sacred space and retrieved the staffs. 11 remained as they were, dry, unchanged, dead wood. Aaron's staff had transformed. Buds emerged along its length. Blossoms opened. Almonds appeared, fully formed and ripe. The entire life cycle of a tree compressed into one night on a branch severed from its roots. The symbolism cuts deep. Human ambition produces nothing. Korah's rhetoric, however sophisticated, remains sterile. Political maneuvering bears no fruit. Authority seized by force stays barren. Aaron did nothing. He brought dead wood like everyone else. The difference came from divine choice alone. God's selection produces life. His appointment bears fruit. His designated mediator channels blessing, not because of personal merit, but because God declares it so. The almond matters. This tree blooms first in the ancient Near East, while winter still grips the land. It signals watchfulness, awakening, God's attention. The Hebrew word for almond shares roots with the word to watch. Aaron's rod proclaimed, God watches over his chosen means of mediation. This wasn't magic, it was grammar, divine communication through object lesson. The staff said what words could not convey. Priesthood is gift, not achievement. Mediation exists by grace, not by democratic vote or popular acclaim. The people got their answer, not through argument, but through undeniable witness. Aaron's authority came from the same source as the staff's fruit, God's inexplicable sovereign choice. Moses placed the staff before the ark permanently, a standing testimony. Future generations would see it and remember. When ambition rises, when egalitarian impulses challenge structure, when someone asks, why him and not me, the blooming staff answers, because God said so, because life comes only from his hand. The rod remained a memorial, a warning, a comfort. Some structures exist not by human design, but by divine necessity. Mediation between holy God and sinful people requires divine appointment. Otherwise, everyone approaching the sacred space dies. Korah wanted democracy. God insisted on designated grace. The earth swallowed rebellion, the staff bloomed life. Both proclaimed the same truth from different directions. Authority that serves becomes life-giving. Authority that grasps becomes death-dealing. Aaron didn't reach for the roll. It reached for him. His staff didn't force fruit. Fruit appeared as gift. The almond blossoms fell eventually. The almonds were eaten, but the wood remained, testifying. Life springs from dead things only when God chooses. No amount of human effort, clever argument, or popular support can manufacture what only divine selection produces. The camp learned to live with hierarchy, not because tyranny deserves acceptance, but because mediation deserves gratitude. Someone stands between them and consuming holiness. That someone must be chosen by God, or the mediation itself becomes deadly. The waters of Meribah, Moses' fatal mistake, 40 years compressed into silence. The text says almost nothing about these decades. The first generation died slowly, one by one, until their bones scattered across the wilderness. Their children grew, learned, watched their parents' judgment unfold. Then on the edge of fulfillment, the cycle repeated. The new generation, not yet hardened by trial, faced the old crisis. No water. They gathered against Moses and Aaron. The complaints sounded familiar. Why did you bring us to this terrible place? Why did you lead us out of Egypt to perish in the desert? The words echoed their parents' rebellion, as if trauma carried forward in language itself. Moses had heard this before. Decades earlier, at another place without water, God told him to strike the rock. Water poured forth. The people drank. Crisis averted. This time, God gave different instructions. Take the staff, gather the assembly, speak to the rock before their eyes. Water would flow. The command was specific. Speak, not strike. Words, not violence. Rhetoric, not force. Moses and Aaron gathered the people before the rock. Frustration boiled over. Moses spoke, but not to the rock, to the people. Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water from this rock? The words dripped with contempt, exhaustion, rage accumulated over 40 years. The shift from God's provision to we was subtle, fatal. He raised the staff once, twice. He struck the rock with force. Water gushed out, abundant, miraculous. The people drank deeply. The crisis ended. But something broke that couldn't be repaired. God spoke to Moses and Aaron immediately. Because you did not trust me to show my holiness before the people, you will not bring this assembly into the land I'm giving them. The sentence seems harsh. Water flowed. The miracle worked. What exactly was the crime? The text calls the place Meribah, quarreling. But the deeper issue wasn't the people's complaint. It was Moses' response. God intended to display his character through gentle speech, words calling forth provision, grace manifesting through verbal invitation. Moses displayed something else: anger, frustration, power, exercised through violence against stone. The striking suggested water came by force, by human effort, by Moses and Aaron's exasperation, finally making the rock yield. The rhetoric mattered. Moses called them rebels. Technically accurate, but pastorally devastating. He claimed the miracle as our action, obscuring divine agency. He struck twice, suggesting the first blow wasn't enough. That provision required repeated human effort. Every detail communicated wrong theology. God wanted the people to see him as generous provider who responds to requests. Moses showed them an angry leader, beating resources from reluctant nature. The staff Moses carried bore significance. It wasn't his staff, it was Aaron's rod, the one that bloomed. The instrument of divine choice, of life springing from deadwood by God's sovereign grace. Using it to strike in anger profaned its meaning. Moses' sin wasn't disobedience alone. It was failed communication, distorted witness, misrepresenting God's character at a crucial teaching moment. The people needed to learn that God gives freely. Moses taught them the opposite. The punishment fits perfectly. Moses brought people to the edge of promise through 40 years of intercession, leadership, and sacrifice. But he couldn't complete the journey. He modeled law brilliantly. He couldn't embody the grace needed for entrance. Someone else would lead them across Jordan. Joshua, whose name means God saves, would bring them in. The transition from Moses to Joshua enacted theology. Law brings you to the boundary. Grace carries you through. Moses accepted the sentence without recorded protest. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps decades of carrying impossible burdens had prepared him for this final lesson in limitation. Even the greatest prophet remains human. Even the humblest man on earth has moments where frustration overwhelms calling. The water still flowed. God's provision continued despite failed mediation. The people drank regardless of Moses' error. Grace persisted through human weakness, but consequences remained. Moses would see the land from Nebo's heights. He would not enter. Meribah became a double memorial. God's faithfulness and human limitation. Abundant water and a barred entrance. Miracle and tragedy flowing from the same rock in the same moment. The bronze serpent, a paradox of salvation. The people spoke against God and Moses again. The complaints were familiar by now. No bread, no water, we hate this miserable food. The cycle of ingratitude continued, even among those who should have learned from their parents' fate. God's response was immediate. Venomous serpents entered the camp. The text calls them seraphim, burning ones. Their bite inflamed flesh. People died in agony. The wilderness, which had provided manna and quail, now provided death. The people recognized their sin quickly. This time they came to Moses with confession. We sinned, we spoke against God and against you. Pray to God to remove the serpents. Moses interceded as always. But God's answer twisted expectation. He didn't remove the serpents. The threat remained. Instead, he provided a way to survive within the danger. Make a serpent of bronze, God instructed. Set it on a pole. Anyone bitten should look at it. Those who looked would live. Moses obeyed. He fashioned the bronze serpent and raised it high where everyone could see. The remedy seemed absurd. Look at an image of the thing destroying you. Gaze upon a metal replica of your death. This will save you. Yet it worked. Those bitten, feeling venom course through their bodies, looked up at the bronze serpent. They lived. Those who refused to look, perhaps thinking the cure too simple or strange, died from their wounds. The paradox cuts to the heart of biblical soteriology. Salvation comes through the symbol of judgment. Healing arrives by facing the instrument of death. The serpent on the pole embodies both curse and cure, wound and remedy in single image. The serpent carried weight beyond immediate crisis. In Eden, the serpent brought death through deception. Here, a serpent brings life through honest confrontation. The bronze material mattered. Permanent, reflective, crafted by human hands at divine command. Not a living serpent, but its essential form, death's shape, emptied of death's power. Looking required something profound. It demanded trust that defied reason. Your body burns with venom, your flesh swells, death approaches, and the cure is to stare at a metal snake. The action seemed ridiculous, ineffective, too simple. But simplicity was precisely the point. Salvation doesn't come through complex ritual or heroic effort. It comes through trust, through looking away from yourself and toward what God provides, no matter how strange the provision appears. Those who looked acknowledged their need. The act admitted helplessness. You couldn't heal yourself. You couldn't extract the venom. You couldn't earn survival. You could only look, trust, receive. Those who refused to look likely refused to admit their condition was beyond self-remedy. Perhaps they tried other cures, herbal remedies, incantations, anything but the absurd bronze serpent. Pride interferes with survival when the cure humbles us. The serpent stayed raised for the entire journey, a permanent reminder. Some placed it in the tabernacle, tradition suggests. Generations later, it required destruction. People began worshipping it, burning incense to it, calling it Nehushtan, bronze thing. Even instruments of grace become idols when we forget they merely point beyond themselves. But in the wilderness, it served its purpose. Life came through looking. Healing came through facing judgment's image. Salvation came through the strangest means imaginable, staring at what could kill you, transformed into what preserves you. The mechanics remained mysterious. Why did looking heal? The text doesn't explain. No magic in the bronze, no power in the metal. The serpent simply directed faith toward God's promise. He said, "Look and live." Those who trusted the word, despite its strangeness, survived. The living serpents never left. They remained in the camp, a constant danger. But their threat lost power over those who knew where to look. The bronze serpent didn't eliminate danger. It provided a way through danger. Salvation doesn't always mean removal of threat. Sometimes it means grace to endure within threat's presence. Balaam's donkey, the comedy that subverts prophecy. The story shifts tone dramatically. After serpents and divine judgment, we encounter something unexpected. Comedy, satire, a talking animal, and a prophet who can't see what his donkey perceives. Balak, king of Moab, watched the people advance. He saw what happened to the Amorites. Their armies fell, their cities were taken. Terror gripped him. Military opposition seemed futile, so he reached for spiritual weapons. He sent messengers to Balaam, a renowned diviner living far to the east near the Euphrates. The message was direct. "Come, curse these people for me. They're too powerful. Perhaps if you curse them, I can defeat them and drive them away. I know that those you bless stay blessed, and those you curse stay cursed." The request recognized something true. Words have power. Prophetic speech shapes reality. Balaam's reputation extended across kingdoms. If anyone could curse effectively, he could. Balaam asked the messengers to wait overnight. God spoke to him that night. "Don't go with them. Don't curse the people, because they're blessed." Morning came. Balaam sent the messengers away. God said no. Simple answer. But Balak persisted. He sent more messengers, more distinguished ones, with promises of great honor and payment. Balaam's response reveals his character. He claimed he couldn't go against God's word, even for a palace full of silver and gold. Noble speech. But then he asked them to stay the night while he inquired of God again. Why ask twice? God already said no. The second inquiry betrayed desire. Balaam wanted the reward. He wanted permission to do what he knew was prohibited. God gave troubling permission. "Go with them, but speak only what I tell you." The permission carried warning. Balaam saddled his donkey and departed with the Moabite princes. Then the narrative turns strange. God's anger burned because Balaam went, but God gave permission. The text creates deliberate tension. Permission doesn't always mean approval. God sometimes lets people pursue their desires to expose their hearts. An angel of the Lord stood in the road, sword drawn. The donkey saw it. Balaam didn't. The animal turned aside into a field. Balaam struck the donkey, forcing it back to the path. The angel appeared again, this time where the path narrowed between vineyard walls. The donkey pressed against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot. He struck the animal again. The angel appeared a third time, where no room remained to turn. The donkey lay down under Balaam. His rage erupted. He beat the donkey with his staff. Then God opened the donkey's mouth. The animal spoke. "What have I done to you that you've struck me 3 times?" Balaam answered without apparent shock. "You've made a fool of me. If I had a sword, I'd kill you right now." The donkey responded with devastating logic. "Am I not your donkey which you've ridden all your life until today? Have I ever done this to you before?" "No," Balaam admitted. Then God opened Balaam's eyes. He saw the angel, sword drawn, standing in the path. Balaam fell face down immediately. The angel spoke. "Why did you strike your donkey 3 times?" "I came to oppose you because your path is reckless before me. The donkey saw me and turned away 3 times. If it hadn't, I would have killed you by now, but spared the donkey." Think about the layers of absurdity. A renowned prophet can't see what his donkey perceives. An animal shows more spiritual sensitivity than a professional diviner. The beast speaks more reasonably than its master. The one who curses for money gets rebuked by his means of transportation. The satire bites. Balaam claims to speak for God, but can't perceive God's messenger. He beats the very creature saving his life. His spiritual blindness becomes literal, comic, and ultimately humiliating. Yet God permits him to continue. "Go to Balak, but speak only my words." The setup is complete. A prophet with a reputation for effective curses, hired to curse people God has blessed, who can't even see angels his donkey perceives. The subsequent scenes deliver the punchline repeatedly. Balak takes Balaam to high places overlooking the camp. Altars are built. Sacrifices are offered. The elaborate ritual begins. Balaam opens his mouth to curse. Blessings pour out instead. 4 times this happens. 4 prophetic oracles, each more glowing than the last. Balak's frustration builds. "That's not what I'm paying you for. Stop blessing them." Balaam shrugs helplessly. "I told you I can only speak what God puts in my mouth. The curses won't come. God has blessed them. No divination can change it. No magic can counter it. The people are blessed because God says so." The final oracle goes further. Balaam prophesies future triumph. A star rises from Jacob. A scepter emerges from Israel. Moab will be conquered. Edom subdued. Even Amalek faces doom. Balak's plot backfires completely. He hired someone to weaken his enemies. Instead, they're blessed repeatedly in poetic, memorable form. The comedy is cosmic reversal. Human schemes against God's declared purpose become their own refutation. The donkey episode establishes this perfectly. Before we hear the oracles, we see Balaam's true character. He's spiritually blind, despite professional credentials. He's motivated by gain, despite pious language. He ignores clear warning, despite claiming prophetic sensitivity. His donkey is more righteous than he is. The message is clear. God's blessing on the people doesn't depend on their merit. It depends on his choice. No curse can touch them because God has spoken differently. Even a compromised prophet becomes a mouthpiece for truth when God determines what will be said. The story functions as comedy, but comedy with teeth. It mocks human pretension. It satirizes prophets for hire. It demonstrates divine sovereignty through humiliating circumstances. Balaam wanted gold. He got theological precision forced through his mouth. Balak wanted curses. He got an enemy repeatedly blessed in his presence. The donkey never speaks again. That single miraculous conversation serves its purpose. It reveals what needs revealing: a beast with clearer sight than a seer, an animal with more sense than a prophet. 3 times it saves its master's life. 3 times it's beaten for the service. Grace sometimes comes through unlikely messengers. Truth sometimes speaks through unexpected mouths. And sometimes God's sovereignty displays itself most clearly when he makes a donkey wiser than a prophet. The Baal of Peor, seduction at the finish line. The people camped at Shittim in the plains of Moab with the Jordan River visible to the west. 40 years of wandering neared completion. The new generation had proven itself in battle against Amorite kings. Victory seemed inevitable. The land was within reach. Then they fell, not to armies but to seduction. Moabite women came to the camp. They invited the men to sacrifices for their gods. The people accepted. They ate ritual meals. They bowed to foreign deities. The text states it plainly. The people yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. This wasn't casual cultural exchange. The Baal of Peor involved ritualized immorality as worship. The god's cult centered on fertility rites, sacred unions, and deliberate boundary violations. What Israel encountered wasn't mere religious pluralism. It was comprehensive seduction, physical, spiritual, and communal. The combination proved devastating. Where military threats failed, intimate invitations succeeded. Where curses couldn't touch them, desire did. The people walked willingly into what no enemy could force them into. Covenant betrayal at the threshold of fulfillment. God's anger burned. A plague broke out immediately. People began dying in numbers that dwarfed battlefield casualties. The text reports 24,000 died before the plague stopped. Moses received instructions. Take all the leaders who joined the apostasy. Execute them in broad daylight before God. The severity matched the crime. This wasn't private sin. It was public betrayal of national covenant at the most critical moment. Then an incident crystallized the whole crisis. While the people wept at the tent of meeting, while the plague raged, while Moses and the leaders dealt with the catastrophe, a man from the tribe of Simeon brought a Midianite woman into the camp, into his family, publicly, brazenly, in direct sight of everyone. Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, saw it. He took a spear, followed the couple into the tent, and drove the spear through both of them. The plague stopped immediately. The text presents this without moral ambiguity. Phinehas's zeal turned away wrath from the people. His action honored God's demand for holiness at the boundary. God confirmed it with a covenant of lasting priesthood for Phinehas's descendants. His zeal earned perpetual priestly status. Modern readers struggle with this passage. The violence seems excessive, the sexual dimension uncomfortable, the divine approval of Phinehas's act troubling. But the ancient context clarifies what's at stake. The people stood at the finish line. Everything their parents lost through unbelief, this generation could gain through trust. The land waited. God's promises approached fulfillment. At this exact moment, wholesale abandonment of covenant would nullify everything. 40 years in the wilderness would become meaningless if they entered the land already compromised, already unfaithful, already syncretized with Canaanite religion. The plague wasn't arbitrary divine anger, it was consequence. Covenant violation brings death because covenant sustained life in the first place. The relationship with God enabled everything, the exodus, the wilderness survival, the military victories. Breaking that relationship removed the foundation. Death followed naturally. Phinehas's act stopped the plague because it represented the community's rejection of the betrayal. One man's public zeal symbolized what should have been everyone's response. The brazen couple represented the crisis. Phinehas's spear represented resolution. The community's tolerance had to end for the community's survival. The strategic timing reveals deeper pattern. This wasn't random temptation. Balak couldn't curse them. Balaam's oracles blessed them instead. But Balaam gave Balak advice. Tradition records, if you can't curse them, corrupt them, lead them into sin, God will judge them himself. The Moabite Midianite seduction followed this strategy precisely. External opposition failed, internal corruption succeeded. Where frontal assault was repelled, subtle infiltration worked. Where military defeat was impossible, moral compromise achieved the same result. The danger wasn't merely physical desire, it was theological erosion. The Baal of Peor offered a competing vision: fertility without faithfulness, pleasure without covenant, religious experience without exclusive loyalty. The people could have everything, their god and these gods, their identity and Moabite practices, their distinctiveness and cultural integration. This illusion almost destroyed them. You cannot serve both. You cannot maintain covenant while embracing what covenant explicitly forbids. The land they were about to enter was full of these temptations. Canaanite religion permeated the culture. If they couldn't resist at Shittim, they would dissolve in Canaan. The plague's death toll exceeded losses from the golden calf incident. The severity matched the proximity to fulfillment. They had one task left: cross the river and take possession. The tragedy was dying at the door, perishing at the threshold, losing everything within sight of having it all. 24,000 died. The survivors learned the hardest lesson yet. The greatest danger isn't external opposition, it's internal compromise. The deadliest threat isn't the enemy you face in battle, it's the seduction you welcome into camp. The crisis also exposed who they really were at this point, a generation tempered by their parents' failure, tested by wilderness discipline, victorious in initial battles, yet still vulnerable to the oldest temptation: the belief that you can have God's promises while ignoring God's terms. Phinehas's spear created a memorial. His zeal established a standard. His descendants would serve as priests, precisely because he demonstrated what priesthood requires: willingness to act when the community's covenant life hangs in balance, even when action costs everything. The plague ended. The dead were buried. The people purified themselves. And the lesson remained, carved into memory by loss. Victory comes through faithfulness, not merely through strength. Defeat comes through compromise, not merely through battle. The finish line is where you're most vulnerable, not most secure. They would remember Shittim. The name itself, acacia, would carry bitter weight, beautiful trees, dark memory, the place where they almost lost everything within sight of receiving it all. A new generation, the second census, and daughters' rights. After the plague, God commanded another census. Count the people again. Take a full military registration. The first census happened at Sinai at the journey's beginning. This second census happened on the plains of Moab at the journey's end. The numbers tell the story. The first census counted 603,550 fighting men. The second census counted 601,730. Nearly identical totals, different people. Every man counted in the first census had died. Not one crossed over. Joshua and Caleb alone survived from the original military-age population. The second census counted entirely new individuals, sons who watched their father's generation perish, men who grew knowing they existed because of their parents' failure and God's patience. The census wasn't merely administrative, it served theological purpose. The new generation was complete, ready, numerous enough, strong enough. The wilderness hadn't depleted them. 40 years of wandering hadn't destroyed the nation. They emerged from judgment, prepared for conquest. The census also determined inheritance portions. The land would be divided according to tribal size. Each clan would receive territory proportional to their numbers. The census linked present reality to future possession. Your place in the wilderness counted toward your place in the land. But then something unprecedented occurred. 5 women stepped forward with a legal challenge that would reshape inheritance law. Zelophehad from the tribe of Manasseh had died in the wilderness. He left 5 daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. No sons. Under existing law, their father's name and inheritance would disappear. His portion would dissolve into the tribe's general holdings. His daughters would become dependent on male relatives, receiving nothing in their own right. The daughters approached Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the entire assembly at the tent of meeting's entrance. Public setting, official forum. They presented their case clearly. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. The request was revolutionary. Women didn't inherit land. Property passed through male lines exclusively. This preserved family holdings, prevented fragmentation, and maintained patriarchal structures. The daughters weren't asking for exception, they were challenging the entire system. Moses didn't answer immediately. He brought their case before God. God's response affirmed them completely. The daughters of Zelophehad speak rightly. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives. Transfer their father's inheritance to them. Then God expanded the principle into permanent law. If a man dies without sons, his inheritance passes to daughters. If no daughters, to his brothers. If no brothers, to his father's brothers. If his father has no brothers, to the nearest relative. A clear hierarchy, but daughters were now legally recognized heirs. This moment represents more than legal adjustment. It reveals covenant flexibility, divine responsiveness to justice, and women's agency within patriarchal structures. The daughters demonstrated courage. They stood before the nation's leadership, all male, and demanded their rights. They risked rejection, humiliation, and permanent loss. They could have stayed silent, accepted custom, and disappeared into obscurity. Instead, they argued from principle. Their father didn't rebel like Korah. He didn't participate in the golden calf apostasy or the Baal of Peor incident. He died for his own sin like everyone else in his generation, but deserved to be remembered. His name shouldn't vanish because gender determined inheritance. Moses' response demonstrated wisdom. He didn't dismiss them out of hand. He didn't defend existing practice simply because it was traditional. He brought the case to God, admitting the law needed divine clarification. God's verdict validated their claim entirely. The existing law was incomplete. It didn't address their situation fairly. The legal code needed amendment to prevent injustice. And women's voices prompted that amendment. This establishes important precedent. Law isn't static. Covenant doesn't require rigid adherence to forms that produce unintended injustice. When faithful people identify genuine problems, when they argue from covenant principles rather than personal gain, the law can adapt. Later, tribal leaders from Manasseh raised concern. If daughters inherit and then marry men from other tribes, land would transfer between tribes, violating territorial boundaries. God responded with additional regulation. Daughters who inherit must marry within their father's tribe, preserving tribal holdings. The daughters agreed. They married their cousins, staying within Manasseh's clans. Their courage achieved what they sought. Their father's name lived on. His property passed to them, and they became landowners in the promised territory. Their names are recorded permanently. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, 5 women who changed inheritance law for every generation after them. Their case established that women could inherit, own land, and participate in covenant community as property holders, not merely as dependents. The timing matters. This happened after the plague, after the crisis of Baal of Peor, after the second census confirmed the new generation's readiness. At the moment of preparation for conquest, God addressed internal justice. Before they took the land, they needed to ensure they would distribute it fairly. The daughters' case also demonstrated something about this new generation. They questioned. When questioning served justice, they approached authority respectfully but firmly. They argued from principle, not merely from personal interest. They represented the kind of faithful engagement with law that strengthens community rather than fractures it. The second census counted them. The legal case vindicated them. The land would include their portion. 5 women who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. 5 daughters who proved that covenant community means continual refinement toward fairness, not rigid preservation of tradition regardless of cost. They inherited. Their father's name remained. And biblical law expanded to include them. The new generation was indeed ready, not just for warfare, but for justice. The Book of Wars, lost epics and ritual poetry. The narrative briefly quotes something unusual, a fragment, a citation, words preserved from sources older than the text itself, from the Book of the Wars of the Lord, Waheb in Sufah and the Wadis of the Arnon. The quotation ends abruptly, incomplete, mysterious. The book of the wars of the Lord is mentioned nowhere else in Scripture. No copies survive. We possess only these fragmentary verses, quoted to establish geographical boundaries and commemorate victories. The reference reveals something crucial about how ancient texts worked. The narrative wasn't created in isolation. It drew from earlier sources, referenced existing documents, and assumed audience familiarity with circulating materials. The Book of Wars was apparently well known enough to cite without explanation. What was this lost book? Likely a collection of victory songs, battle poetry, and ritual commemorations. Ancient Near Eastern cultures maintained such collections. They served multiple purposes, preserving military history, celebrating divine intervention, teaching geography, and providing liturgical material for festivals. The fragments we possess suggest poetic structure, rhythmic language, geographical markers, references to wadis, rivers, and boundaries. This wasn't dry military chronicle. It was artistic celebration of God's warfare on the people's behalf. The text quotes these poems when establishing territorial boundaries or explaining place names. The poetry provided authoritative witness. Battles fought became songs sung. Military campaigns transformed into liturgical memory. The wars themselves generated literature that outlasted the warriors. Other poetic fragments appear throughout this section. Victory song after defeating Sihon, celebrations after conquering Og. These poems share characteristics. They're rhythmic, repetitive, geographically specific, and theologically focused. They attribute victory to divine action while recording human participation. Consider the pattern. Battle happens. Victory comes. Poem emerges. The poem gets collected. Later generations quote it. The quotation establishes authority. The cycle preserves memory through aesthetic form. This explains why the narrative includes poetry at crucial moments. Poetry accomplishes what prose cannot. It makes memory portable. It creates communal voice. It turns individual experience into shared identity. Sing a battle and people remember. Tell it in prose and they forget. The Book of Wars likely contains songs from different periods and authors. Some might have dated back to wilderness battles. Others might have been added as conquest continued. The collection grew as victories accumulated. Each generation contributed its testimony to the expanding archive. The geographical detail in these fragments serves purpose. Waheb in Sufa and the Wadis of the Arnon mark specific locations. The poetry anchors memory to landscape. Walk through these wadis centuries later, and the poems provide narrative. The land itself becomes mnemonic device. The text also includes taunts and mockery poems. After Sihon's defeat, a poem mocks Moab's god Chemosh for failing to protect his people. The poetry isn't merely celebratory, it's theological polemic. Your gods couldn't save you. Our God won the battle. The evidence lies in your destroyed cities. This reveals ancient warfare's religious dimension. Battles weren't merely political or territorial. They were cosmic contests between deities. Victory proved whose god possessed greater power. Defeat indicated divine abandonment. The poems that commemorated warfare therefore carried theological weight far beyond military chronicle. The lost Book of Wars represented extensive tradition. How many poems did it contain? How many battles did it commemorate? How far back did its earliest entries reach? We cannot know. The text survives only through these fragmentary quotations, hints of a larger literary culture now vanished. But the quotations themselves demonstrate something important. The biblical narrative situated itself within existing literary tradition. It didn't claim to create history from nothing. It referenced, quoted, and built upon earlier sources. The writers knew, and expected their audience to know, these older materials. This suggests a literate culture with circulating texts, shared traditions, and communal memory preserved through written and oral forms. The Book of Wars probably existed alongside other collections, perhaps genealogies, maybe legal compilations, possibly prophetic oracles, an entire literary ecosystem mostly lost, occasionally glimpsed through quotation. The poetry's ritual function shouldn't be overlooked. These songs likely accompanied festivals, military musters, and covenant renewal ceremonies. Singing the wars reinforced identity, reciting victories recalled divine faithfulness. The poems functioned as theology in memorable form. The fragments also reveal aesthetic sensibility. Hebrew poetry at this period followed specific patterns, parallelism, repeated structures, rhythmic cadence designed for memorization. The quoted verses demonstrate sophisticated literary technique. This wasn't crude propaganda, it was artful commemoration that balanced aesthetic form with theological content. The survival of only fragments raises haunting questions. How much ancient Israelite literature has vanished? What songs, poems, legal texts, and wisdom collections existed but left no trace except occasional references? The Book of Wars represents the visible tip of a submerged literary iceberg, yet what remains serves purpose. The quotations establish that this nation had memory infrastructure. They preserved victories through art, they passed tradition through beauty. They created lasting testimony through words crafted to survive multiple generations. The wars themselves faded into past. The warriors died, the battles ended, but the songs remained, at least for a while. And even when the Book of Wars itself disappeared, these few quoted lines persisted, carrying forward a whisper of vanished epic tradition. The people who fought these battles also sang them. The nation that conquered territory also created poetry. Warfare and worship intertwined. Military campaigns generated liturgical material. Every victory became occasion for art. This reminds us that ancient faith wasn't abstract theology alone, it was lived experience transformed into memorable form. Battle became ballad, victory became verse, conquest became cantata. The religious life encompassed not just sacrifice and law, but also beauty, rhythm, and communal song. The Book of the Wars of the Lord, lost but once vital, quoted but unrecoverable, a reminder that we possess fragments of a culture far richer than surviving texts alone reveal. The Transjordan conquest, the ambiguous first victory. The journey brought them to the Amorite kingdom east of the Jordan. Sihon ruled from Heshbon, controlling territory from the Arnon River northward. The people needed passage through his land to reach the river, crossing opposite Jericho. Moses sent messengers to Sihon with a straightforward request: "Let us pass through your land. We'll stay on the main road. We won't turn into fields or vineyards. We won't drink water from wells. We'll simply pass through your territory." Sihon refused. More than refused, he mustered his entire army and marched out to confront them at Jahaz. The rejection forced military response. The battle came swiftly. The text describes complete victory. They struck Sihon down with the sword, taking possession of his entire kingdom from the Arnon to the Jabbok, from the wilderness to the Ammonites. They captured all his cities and settled in them, including Heshbon and all its surrounding towns. The first real conquest, not wandering, not waiting, actual warfare with territorial gain. The new generation's initial military test. They passed decisively. They moved northward. Og, king of Bashan, ruled the territory north of the Jabbok. He came out against them at Edrei with his full force. God instructed Moses directly, "Don't fear him. I've handed him over to you, along with all his people and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon." They struck down Og, his sons, and his entire army. No survivors remained. They took possession of his land. The text emphasizes Og's stature and strength. His iron bed measured 9 cubits by 4 cubits, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. He was among the last of the Rephaim, the ancient giants, yet he fell like any other king. 2 kingdoms conquered, substantial territory secured. The people now controlled the entire region east of the Jordan, from the Arnon River to Mount Hermon. Rich land, good pastures, cities already built, an unexpected prize. Then complications emerged. The tribes of Reuben and Gad possessed large herds and flocks. They saw the conquered territory's value for livestock. They approached Moses, Eleazar, and the leaders with a proposal. "This land is suitable for livestock, and we have livestock. Let us settle here, don't make us cross the Jordan." Moses' response came sharp with anger. "Should your brothers go to war while you sit here? Why discourage the people from crossing into the land God is giving them? This is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to view the land. They discouraged everyone, and that whole generation died in the wilderness. Now you're doing the same thing. Stop here, and God's anger will burn against the entire community again." The accusation struck deep. Moses saw history repeating, another generation choosing comfort over calling, another refusal to complete the mission, another preference for immediate gain over covenant fulfillment. The tribes responded carefully. They weren't refusing to fight. They proposed a compromise. "Let us build pens for our livestock and cities for our families here. Then we'll arm ourselves and go ahead of the other tribes into battle. We won't return until everyone has received their inheritance across the Jordan. We don't want inheritance on the western side because we'll have received ours here on the east." Moses accepted the terms with conditions. "If you arm yourselves and fight until the land is conquered, then this territory will be yours. But if you fail to do this, you'll have sinned against God, and your sin will find you. Build cities for your families and pens for your flocks, but do what you've promised." Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh agreed. They would cross armed, fight with their brothers, and return only after conquest was complete. Moses formalized the arrangement before Eleazar, Joshua, and the tribal leaders. The decision created a geographic split from the start. The nation's unity would now span a river. The eastern tribes settled outside the land proper, in territory not originally promised. Their choice established precedent for living adjacent to, rather than within, the promised inheritance. The text reports this matter-of-factly, but implications ripple forward. The eastern settlement introduced division into the tribal structure. Physical separation would eventually breed cultural and religious distance. The Jordan River, meant to be crossed, became a permanent boundary within the nation itself. Yet the arrangement also demonstrated flexibility. The conquest secured more territory than initially designated. Rather than abandoning good land, they incorporated it. The tribal structure adapted to unexpected success. Pragmatism met principle, and compromise emerged. The eastern tribes kept their word. They crossed Jordan armed. They fought in conquest campaigns. They remained until the land was subdued. Only then did they return to their families and flocks east of the river. Joshua later dismissed them with blessing, acknowledging their faithful service. But questions remained. Was their choice wise? They prioritized livestock over full participation in the land of promise. They valued immediate economic advantage over complete integration with their covenant community. They settled where they stood, rather than where God originally designated. The text doesn't explicitly condemn them, neither does it fully endorse them. The ambiguity reflects reality. Their decision was understandable but potentially problematic, reasonable but risky, permissible but not ideal. The Transjordan conquest itself succeeded completely. 2 kingdoms fell, no coalition formed against them. The victories came quickly and decisively. The new generation proved capable. They could fight, they could win, they could take territory. The settlement pattern, however, introduced complexity. From the beginning, the 12 tribes occupied 2 distinct regions. The Jordan River divided them geographically. That geographic division would in time manifest as political, religious, and cultural separation. The irony is sharp. The first conquest created the first division. Victory produced complications. Success generated new problems. They gained territory but lost unified settlement. They won battles but compromised wholeness. The eastern tribes built cities. They established themselves. They named their settlements and claimed the land. Reuben rebuilt Heshbon, Elealeh, Kiriataim, Nebo, and Baal-Meon. Gad fortified Dibon, Ataroth, Aroer, and others. The half-tribe of Manasseh took Gilead and Bashan. They were home, but home was east of promise. They possessed inheritance, but inheritance was outside the originally designated land. They belonged to the nation, but they lived beyond its natural boundary. The ambiguity remains unresolved at the text's end. The eastern tribes exist as full members of the community, yet separate from it, fully committed to the conquest, yet choosing to live outside the main prize, faithful in warfare, yet prioritizing livestock value over complete integration. The Transjordan conquest succeeded militarily. It complicated things covenantally. Both things remain true. Victory and division, success and ambiguity, conquest and compromise. The new generation won their first battles. They also made their first questionable decision. And both realities would shape everything that followed. The map of trauma, retracing the wilderness stations. The text suddenly provides a complete itinerary, a list station by station from Egypt to the plains of Moab. 42 locations, a wilderness map traced in place names, each marking where the people camped during their long wandering. Moses recorded these stages at God's command. The list begins. They departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, the day after Passover. The people marched out boldly in sight of all the Egyptians. The journey's opening shines with triumph, departure, liberation. Egypt watching powerless to stop them. The route traced freedom's first steps. Then the names continue. Succoth, Etham, Pi-Hahiroth, Migdol, through the sea into the wilderness of Shur, Marah, Elim, Red Sea, wilderness of Sin. Each name a milestone, each location a memory. Some names carry obvious meaning. Marah means bitter, the place where water was undrinkable until Moses made it sweet. Elim means trees or palms, the oasis with 12 springs and 70 palm trees where they found relief. The names themselves tell compressed stories. Other names remain obscure: Dofka, Alush, Rephidim. We know little about these stations beyond their position in the sequence. The people camped there, they moved on. The locations mattered enough to record, but not enough to explain. The list includes sites of major events: Sinai, where the law was given; Kibroth Hatava, graves of craving, where those who demanded meat were buried; Hazeroth, where Miriam was struck with skin disease for challenging Moses. These names anchor the itinerary to narrative, giving the geographic list dramatic weight. But most names appear only in this list, no stories attached to them, no events recorded. They represent the vast stretches of time between crises, the long, undramatic years of waiting, the slow march toward death that consumed a generation. 42 stations total. 40 years of wandering. Some stations lasted days, others perhaps years. The list compresses time unevenly. Certain periods explode with activity and detail. Others vanish into silence, marked only by a place name and the phrase, "they departed from and camped at." The itinerary serves multiple purposes. It creates geographic reality. These people weren't wandering aimlessly. They followed a route, specific locations, actual terrain. The journey had structure, even if its purpose was judgment. The list also functions as memorial. Future generations reading these names would remember. Each location represented part of the collective story. The names themselves became liturgy. Reciting the stations meant rehearsing the failure, the patience, the slow death, the eventual arrival. Some scholars suggest the list served practical purposes. Future travelers could follow the route. Pilgrims retracing the journey would know the path. The geographic data preserved actual history rather than mythic narrative. But the list carries theological weight beyond geography. This is the map of a generation's death. Every station marks time passing. Every name represents days or years, closer to the moment when the last member of the condemned generation died and the new generation could finally cross Jordan. The names cluster around Sinai early, suggesting extended stay at the mountain. Then they spread out, representing movement and crisis. Later names appear in the Transjordan region, marking the approach to the Promised Land. The itinerary itself traces the arc from law-giving through rebellion to preparation for conquest. Consider what the list doesn't include: no chronology except at beginning and end, no explanation of duration at each site, no indication of why certain locations were chosen. The names stand alone, a skeleton of the journey without flesh of daily experience. Yet this skeletal quality matters. The list reduces 40 years to place names. It strips away the tedium, the routine, the endless ordinary days of wilderness existence. What remains is structure, route, sequence, the bare bones of a national journey from slavery through judgment to readiness for inheritance. Each name represented someone's memory. Children born at one station and growing up before the next move. Elders dying and being buried at locations whose names marked their graves forever. Families experiencing daily life, births, deaths, marriages, conflicts, reconciliations, all compressed into a single place name in the list. The itinerary also highlights gaps in the narrative. The text tells us almost nothing about 38 years of the 40-year period. This list shows they kept moving, kept camping, kept existing during that silence. The stations prove the people didn't freeze in narrative time. Life continued. They simply weren't doing anything worth recording beyond survival. Some names appear nowhere else in Scripture. They exist only in this list. Rimmon Perez, Libnah, Rissah, Kehelatha, Mount Shepher, Harada, Makeloth, Tahath. These locations entered history once when the people camped there and vanished from memory, except for inclusion in this catalogue. The list ends at the plains of Moab, camped by the Jordan across from Jericho. The final station, journey complete, the map of trauma terminates at the threshold of promise. 42 stations, one generation dead, one generation ready, the wilderness behind, the river ahead. Reading the list becomes a ritual. Each name a bead on a prayer strand, each location a note in a dirge. The stations chant the story without telling it. They mark time without explaining it. They preserve geography without interpreting it. But interpretation emerges from the structure itself. This is where they went. This is how long it took. This is the path from bondage through wilderness to boundary of promise. The map proves the journey happened. The stations verify the story. The names anchor memory to actual landscape. Future generations would walk past some of these locations. They might ask, why is this place named Kibroth Hattahavah? The answer would come, because our ancestors craved meat there and were buried in judgment. The geography itself became teaching tool. The landscape preached. The map of trauma doesn't glorify the journey, it documents it. The stations stand as witnesses, neither condemning nor excusing, simply marking where a nation spent 40 years learning that promise delayed is not promise denied, and that God's timeline rarely matches human expectation. On the plains of Moab, a generation prepared, a leader's farewell. The people spread across the plains of Moab, camped along the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth to Abel Shittim. Behind them lay the wilderness. Before them flowed the river. Beyond the river rose the hills of Canaan. 40 years had passed since their parents refused to enter. That generation rested in wilderness graves, their bones scattered across the route, traced in the itinerary. Only Joshua and Caleb remained from the original Exodus. Everyone else was born or raised in the desert, children of the condemned generation who inherited both promise and warning. They had been tested. Fire from heaven consumed rebels at Taberah. Quail and plague struck at Kibroth Hattahavah. The earth swallowed Korah's faction. Bronze serpents saved those bitten by venomous snakes. Balaam blessed them against his employer's wishes. They fell to seduction at Baal of Peor, and 24,000 died. The second census counted survivors. The daughters of Zelophehad secured inheritance rights. They defeated Sihon and Og, claiming the Transjordan. They were no longer the nation that left Egypt. Wilderness discipline had shaped them. Their parents' failure taught them. They knew the cost of unbelief. They had seen God's judgment and God's mercy, often in the same day. They understood covenant demanded faithfulness, not casual assent. Moses gathered them repeatedly in these final weeks. He reviewed the law. He reminded them of history. He warned them of coming temptations. The speeches that formed Deuteronomy emerged from this moment, a prophet who cannot enter, preparing those who will. Moses himself stood at the edge of his own limitation. 120 years old, the text reports. His sight remained clear, his strength hadn't diminished, yet he would not cross. Meribah's consequences held firm. He struck the rock when God said, "Speak." He represented God's grace as his own angry provision. The error barred him from completion. The pathos is profound. Moses led them out of Egypt. He interceded when God threatened to destroy them. He climbed Sinai to receive law. He judged disputes. He organized the camp. He endured their complaints. He watched his sister and brother die. He guided them through 40 years of purposeless wandering. And now, with the land visible from the plains, he would hand leadership to Joshua and remain behind. Yet the text reports no protest. Moses accepted the decree. He prepared Joshua publicly before the entire assembly. God instructed him to commission his successor openly, conferring authority so the people would follow when Moses was gone. The transfer of leadership demonstrated continuity and change. Joshua had proved himself. He scouted the land and brought back a faithful report. He fought Amalek. He served Moses throughout the wilderness years. He possessed the qualities needed for conquest, courage, faith, military skill, and divine blessing. But Joshua wasn't Moses. He wouldn't speak with God face to face. He wouldn't perform signs like the Egyptian plagues. He wouldn't mediate law from the mountain. His role was specific. Lead the people across, allocate the land, establish them in the territory promised to their ancestors. The people themselves had transformed. They stood ready in a way their parents never did. The first generation saw miracles and complained. This generation grew up with manna and grumbling, understanding both as normal. They lived knowing their parents died for faithlessness. The lesson burned deep. Their military success against the Amorite kingdoms proved their capability. They could fight, they could conquer, they could possess territory. The question wasn't competence, it was faithfulness. Would they trust God enough to attempt what seemed impossible? Would they believe the promise despite the obstacles? The plains of Moab represented liminality, no longer wilderness, not yet promised land, a threshold space where they camped between states of existence. Behind lay judgment and formation. Ahead lay calling and risk. They stood poised between generations. Moses gave them everything he could: law, history, warning, blessing, curses, theological framework, practical instructions, the covenant structure, the promises terms. He poured out wisdom accumulated over decades, knowing these words represented his final gift. The book ends without resolution. The people haven't crossed, the conquest hasn't begun. Moses lives still, though his death draws near. The narrative suspends at the moment of maximum tension. Everything prepared, nothing yet fulfilled. This literary choice matters. The book isn't about completion, it's about readiness. It's not about arrival, but approach. The entire 40-year journey distills into this moment on the plains, where a new generation stands unified, tested, and waiting. The tabernacle still stood at the camp's center. The tribes still arranged themselves around it in designated order. The priests still mediated. The sacrifices still rose. The structure that organized them at Sinai remained intact. They hadn't abandoned the order established at the mountain. They carried it forward, a mobile sacred city approaching its permanent location. The cloud and fire pillar still guided them. They waited on divine signal to move. They had learned painfully that their timing wasn't God's timing. They had tried to invade without permission and failed. They had rebelled when told to advance and died. This generation understood. You go when God says go, and you wait when God says wait. The river flowed between them and the land. Jordan wasn't wide. You could see across it. Cities rose on the western hills. The distance was measurable. But distance matters less than permission. They had military strength to cross by force. They had learned to wait for divine word. Moses stood among them, ancient and vigorous, a living link to the Exodus. He remembered Egypt, he remembered the sea splitting. He remembered Sinai's thunder and smoke. He carried memory of the entire journey, including the parts others wanted to forget. His presence itself testified to God's faithfulness across 4 decades. Soon, he would climb Nebo. He would look across the river at the land he wouldn't enter. He would see from the mountain what he couldn't experience on the ground. Then he would die, and God himself would bury him in an unmarked grave. The greatest prophet would leave no shrine, no tomb for pilgrimage, no location to become idolatrous focus. Joshua would lead them across, the river would part, Jericho would fall, the conquest would begin, but that story belongs to another book. This book ends here on the plains, at the threshold, with an old man preparing to die and a new generation preparing to inherit. The tragedy was complete. The first generation failed, rebelled, and died. The consequence played out over 40 years. The survivors learned the lesson. They stood ready, different from their parents, shaped by their parents' failure into something capable of completing what the previous generation rejected. Yet hope also permeated the ending. They were here, they had survived, they were numerous, unified, and prepared. God's promise hadn't been cancelled, only delayed. The covenant remained active. The land still waited, and the people finally seemed ready to receive it. The book of wilderness, rebellion, and consequence closes with a prepared people and a dying prophet. Behind them, judgment. Before them, promise. Within them, lessons learned at terrible cost. Above them, the cloud that had led them every step, now poised to guide them across the final barrier. They waited on the plains of Moab. The waiting was almost over.